Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, March 25th, 2020. Well, we've all heard the phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. And of course, in every single crisis, you're going to find new emergency powers that are only going to be temporary or only for the terrorists. And of course, those powers never seem to go away. They always try to sneak in more power. So today, I want to cover a report that came out just in the last few days, maybe late last week, early this week, talking about how the Department of Justice is asking Congress for powers that would represent what has been called an unacceptable blow to habeas corpus. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in locked down downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all of our live streaming channels like Facebook, DLive, YouTube, Periscope, and Twitch, plus our archive-only video channels, Library, BitChute, BitTube, Brighteon, and we'll probably be adding others soon. We also have audio-only podcast editions in the archives. That's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Play, and elsewhere. Find all of our archives, all of our show notes, links to important stuff that I reference in every episode, plus the ways to follow us, all the different platforms, and of course our membership program, which really gets us through the tough times and the good times. It helps us grow and expand and reach more people. Those are available starting at just $2 a month. Find all that information over at the show homepage. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Just a quick stop over in the live chat this morning. I really appreciate you joining me, whether it's live or in the archives, and all of the actions that you may take on this show, whether it's a like or a comment or a share or a subscription or a review for iTunes or another podcast platform. All of those trigger the algorithms, the easily triggered algorithms of all the platforms you may be watching or listening on, and it tells the platform to show the program to more people. So thank you so much for all the comments and the feedback and the suggestions for future episodes as well. So hi to my buddy Andrew Nappy down in Florida. Hope you're doing well. Essential Freedom out in Missouri. Kenneth Bogus, Tyler B, Exelerix. I can't read that one over on Twitch, but good to see you. We are being robbed of our freedom. Great quote over on Twitch. Thank you for being here with us. Michael Bogus, as we see you all the time. Thank you. Melody Skaman, Too Tall 509, Pete Hodgkins, Patricia Dance, and everyone else. If I missed you, I'm just kind of scrolling through this quickly because I want to really get into the meat of this today. First of all, the report from Politico, I guess it did come out late last week. It looks like on the 21st. This is from Betsy Woodruff Swan. DOJ seeks new emergency powers amid coronavirus pandemic. Now, mind you, we're always hearing about emergency powers, and I'm going to get a little bit later into the show some of the backing up to the Bush administration on emergency powers and maybe briefly into continuity of government, COG, just lightly. But here's what Betsy wrote. The Justice Department has quietly asked Congress for the ability to ask chief judges to detain people indefinitely without trial during emergencies. Part of a push for new powers that comes on and on. Well, we shouldn't be surprised. Of course, the income tax was going to be a temporary emergency wartime measure. Just a small fraction of the population was going to have to pay for it, just a small percentage of them. And where is that today? I mean, that while a lot of people don't pay it, I would rather everyone is at zero on that, but it certainly has expanded in size and scope. The IRS is one of the most dangerous organizations on earth. We were told that the Patriot Act would just be used for the terrorists. And then, of course, we warned about in the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. This is an annual appropriations measure to fund the military every single year. And the spending just keeps going up. And when they talk about cuts, they're just talking about cutting the rate of increase. They never really cut this thing. But a lot of times they sneak in all kinds of nasty new powers. So in late 2011, for the 2012 annual budget, they included indefinite detention provisions. We'd warned about this considerably for a couple of years and worked with a number of states and localities to try to reject this. And basically, the notion was, oh, they're only going to use this type of power against real bad guys, against the terrorists. And we warned that as soon as you allow them to do this for people you oppose or you're fearful of, they're going to eventually try to expand this to everyone. So it would behoove all of us, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but it would be smart of all of us to pay attention to what they use for, let's call them the others, the people who are not you or me or us, we'll just say. What kind of powers do they use for other people? Because as Thomas Paine warned us, if you want to keep your own liberty secure, you even have to defend your enemies from oppression. So going on further, that's kind of a side rant that I thought was important to mention because we've warned about this being expanded to everyone. Now, it hasn't happened. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of this. I know some alarming sites are saying this has already gone down. It has not happened. I'll get into a statement from the DOJ, which I don't trust, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Documents revealed or reviewed by Politico detail the department's requests to lawmakers on a host of topics, including the statute of limitations, asylum, and the way court hearings are conducted. Going further, the DOJ requests, which are unlikely to make it through a Democratic-led House, I mean, you never know how things are going to play out and who's going to do what. And I don't trust Democrats, even if they want to act like opponents of the current administration. You just really got to see what's going on behind the scenes and pay less attention to the political party or what team is in power in what phase, because there's always the deep state that is pushing for an expansion no matter what. In one of the documents, she writes, the department proposed that Congress grant the Attorney General power to ask the chief judge of any district court to pause court proceedings, quote, this is what really struck out at me, whenever the district court is fully or partially closed by virtue of any natural disaster, civil disobedience, or other emergency situation. Put that in conjunction with a lot of the orders, the stay-at-home, the lockdown orders. I'm not sure what you want to call them. Right now, they're mostly requests because government hasn't been coming in with a hammer. But if government decides to come in with a hammer and the people resist that, that creates a scenario under this demand from the DOJ, this request from the DOJ, civil disobedience. They could just shut down the courts. Interesting. The proposal would also grant those top judges broad authority to pause court proceedings during emergencies. It would apply to, quote, any statutes or rules of procedure otherwise affecting pre-arrest. This is where it gets juicy. Pre-arrest, post-arrest, pre-trial, trial, and post-trial procedures in criminal and juvenile proceedings and all civil process and proceedings. And of course, some people are going to say, you want to make sure that the people who are working in the courts, they're kept safe. But this is so broad and covers so much garbage. And Leslie Goody points out they've already closed all courts in Michigan. I had not seen that. If you've got a link to that, please post that over on YouTube where you're watching, Leslie. But if you can post a link to that, if you've got a report or something that we should be aware of, I will definitely check out the links and the comments a little bit later today, even though I don't get to reply to everything. So thank you for that feedback. And I see some things coming from Danny Huertas as well. I will check out those links a little bit later. But so in other words, they're going to pause court proceedings, pre-trial, pre-arrest, post-arrest. Let's get into a little bit more of what that means here in a moment. Hear from, who is this that wrote this? This is Caroline Fredrickson from the Brennan Center for Justice. She writes, what is most chilling about this proposal is what it would do to habeas corpus. The constitutional guarantee, I don't like how they say that. It doesn't really come from the Constitution, but it is in there. That a detained person has the right to appear in court for a determination of whether his or her detention is lawful. And in fact, this is a civil procedure that I'll explain a little bit more in a few minutes, but habeas is basically it's an action against the jailer. The Justice Department language would allow a judge to order someone who had simply been arrested but not charged or convicted to be held until the judge determines the emergency is over. And let's say you agree that the current emergency is a real emergency, and it's only going to be temporary, and pausing a court proceeding is temporary and needs to be done to protect the health and well-being of everybody. Let's say you agree with all that. Who's to say what's going to qualify as an emergency in the future? And I think that, to me, is what is even more problematic, because emergencies have been, they can throw out emergency for just about anything and everything. Here over at Reason Magazine, who wrote this one? Eric Boehm or Boehm. I apologize if I get that wrong. I've not seen Eric's name before. This comes from Scott Bullock. He quotes from Institute for Justice, IJ.org. We follow them quite a bit and have kind of collaborated with them to support some of their efforts to stop asset forfeiture. We have not worked with them on this issue at all, but it's good to see a quote from them over at Reason. The DOJ proposal is deeply troubling and would raise a whole host of constitutional concerns. That's Scott Bullock, the president and general counsel for Institute for Justice. He goes on further. History demonstrates again and again that governments use a crisis to expand power and violate vital constitutional principles. And when the supposed emergency is over, the expanded powers often become permanent and maybe just temporary, maybe to only a certain degree of people, but they are always expanded. Government, future administrations, if you like what this administration is doing or you liked what the previous one, you should always recognize that a future group of government people will use the powers that you've granted or allowed them to have for things that you like. Future people will use it against you or in ways that you don't like. And I talk about this over and over on this show, that many founders warned us about this. John Dickinson so appropriately said, oppose a disease at its beginning, because once it takes hold, it grows and grows and grows. John Adams, back when he was good, he said, encroachment upon the Constitution is like a cancer. And we can go through many, many examples of that. But the short version is, once it gets in, liberty once lost is lost forever, as Adams put it at one point. Now, this actually came from the Department of Justice, because there was a lot of coverage on this, even in mainstream online publications, Rolling Stone, of course, Politico, and elsewhere. And this comes from a lady named Carrie Kupak, a DOJ spokesperson. And it's just, I couldn't highlight any of this for any of you who are watching because they screenshotted their own statement. They basically said any orders will be in effect for no longer than 30 days. They go on, bottom line, the proposed legislative text confers power upon judges. It does not confer new powers upon the executive branch. These provisions are designed to empower the courts to ensure fair and effective administration of justice. Of course, they're going to say, this is positive, this is okay, we're cool with this. It's conferring the power upon judges, blah, blah, blah. But even 30 days, a single step, Thomas Jefferson once said, to a single step beyond the Constitution is to take control of a boundless field of power. Because we know, as soon as they take a single step, they're going to want to expand it. And here's where habeas is in the Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution. I will link to all of this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And here's what it says in Clause 2. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of invasion, of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So they can't just say habeas corpus, according to the Constitution, habeas can be restricted during a rebellion, not civil disobedience. Civil disobedience does not go to the level of rebellion. They're different things. Disobey is different than rebel. So in cases of rebellion or invasion, and invasion, according to the founders, according to the legal dictionaries of the time, was not just people coming here or an unseen thing coming here, an illness, for example. An invasion really meant a military attack. So if armies are rolling in, then yes, the Constitution does authorize this. I know some of my libertarian friends are very concerned about this as well. But in essence, there's almost no situation where it's authorized to happen in the first place. That's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. In other words, the examples that they're talking about, that the DOJ request is talking about, that isn't in the Constitution. Mind you, there is no clause, article, section, or clause of the Constitution that says this happens unless there's an emergency. You can change this on an emergency. There is no emergency, but it's an emergency clause in the Constitution at all. And here's some interesting overview. Let me pull that pop-up out of the way from a guy named Justin Brooks of the California Innocence Project. It's not an organization I found out about before yesterday, really, but this is some really interesting feedback talking about habeas. He says, so habeas corpus literally in Latin means release the body. And the idea is that it's preserved in our federal constitution and in every state constitution, that someone who is locked up by the government can petition the court for release. Because, of course, the general rule is we're not supposed to trust government. If government says this person is supposed to be locked up, you don't rely on the government doing the right thing. You always have to have procedures and roadblocks in place to get in the way of them being able to just go nuts on people. And he says in his work as director of the California Innocence Project, our basis is always our clients are innocent and they shouldn't be in prison. That's his job. Innocent until proven guilty. So they're going to take the position that everyone is innocent. They're not just criminals. Now, if you go back, there was a point in here in this DOJ statement. I'm trying to find where she said it. Basically, she's talking about how she says criminals should not be able to avoid justice because of a public health emergency. But if we're talking about pre-arrest, pre-trial, and all this, none of these people are criminals. You may be accused, and in fact, they're talking about having this power for people who aren't even accused. Now, her statement is correct. Criminals should not be able to avoid justice. But there's two main caveats. The first of all, we're talking about people who haven't even been charged with a crime. They're not criminals until they've been convicted. And then the next level that I take always is that most criminal law on the books shouldn't even exist. Most people who are deemed criminals for nonviolent actions, these people should not be considered criminals by government. But unfortunately, government at all levels goes way beyond the constitutions, both the federal and state constitutions. So he goes on. And so with habeas, this is Justin Brooks again. So with habeas, you're literally suing the government to release your client. It's actually a civil action. And he goes on, one of the odd things is the named defendant is actually the warden of the prison where the person's being held. And I got that wrong a little bit earlier. But you're actually naming the warden because you're saying, look, this dude or this woman, this person is holding my client. They're locking a person up, and they shouldn't be. They don't have the right to do that. Now, if they could charge people with kidnapping, maybe things would be another story. So without the right of habeas corpus, Justin goes on, what can happen is the government can lock you up, and you have no way of getting release. They can just say, okay, well, your case has never been brought to court, and you're in prison, and your detention could go on forever. And that's basically what they authorized in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. Some people would argue that it really is just narrowly tailored. I think that they do have really... There are very broad ways to read that. And my view on government power is if the government has an opportunity to read any statute, any law, any clause, any provision as a way to, in a way that expands their power, they're always going to do that. And I should have had a few quotes ready for that because there's a bunch of really good ones talking about how ingenious men will always use ingenious reasons to expand their power. They'll read the exact same clause in a different way than it's supposed to be, then you'll read it because they're power hungry. So he goes on. He said, this is why it's such a critical right, not just in innocence cases, but for anyone who gets arrested. Because once you're arrested, even if you shouldn't have been arrested in the first place, let's say you are a criminal, you're still not a criminal until you've actually been convicted of it, at least according to the law. I mean, you're a criminal in moral and philosophical and principled views if you've committed a crime against another person, basically violated their property, their person, used violence on people, etc. But going on, Justin puts it this way. Without a right of habeas, a way of petitioning and making those things happen, You can just start arresting people and hold them in detention for however long the government wants. Now, this has happened in one major time in history. And Joe Wolverton covered this over at the New American Magazine. Joe's a great friend of the 10th Amendment Center. I consider him a friend personally. We keep in touch pretty regularly, but he has a really good overview of this. And he actually, what's interesting, and I'm not really covering it in this episode, but what's interesting is he cited an article that he wrote in 2012 talking about an order that Obama did that's very similar to what we're seeing today, the National Defense Resources Preparedness Order. It basically was the president authorizing himself to take all kinds of powers in an emergency. Now, that hasn't been rescinded by the current president, and of course, it won't be rescinded by anyone, but we should be aware of it. So I encourage you to read that part. It's a little bit off topic, but the way Joe ties it in is really good. What I wanted to cover from him is the point that presidents have issued similar orders in the name of national defense. He writes in his article, for example, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln famously or infamously suspended habeas corpus and the right to an impartial trial as protected by the Sixth Amendment. Now, Lincoln actually, at that time, he suspended it on his own order, but a lot of people were pissed off about that. So then he went to Congress, and he went through that process, and then Congress suspended the writ of habeas. But he would have done that on his own, which makes him even more of a tyrant. I know that's another topic, but this is when it's been done in the past. And if Lincoln did it, why wouldn't someone else do it? And in a time of fear where people are so willing to give government whatever power it wants, whether it's giving out $4-6 trillion, writing checks, bailing out businesses that have done really a bad job of saving money for times of emergency, whatever it may be, give government power to do whatever because I'm scared. Well, I can be scared, but not want government to have power. I'm like frightened of what's going on. And in many ways, I'm much more frightened about the long-term effects of government and government power and bailouts and how they're destroying the dollar and the economy even more and more. All that fiat funny money, they're making it more worse, and that's going to make things more dangerous. And then, of course, things like this that they're trying to slip through. Now, here's the good news. There is a silver lining in this. Not much, but here from Mediaite, which is not really my favorite website, but they have a good collection. I'm not just going to really go through this, but the title I think is important for right now. Left and right resoundingly react to DOJ seeking power to detain indefinitely without trial during emergency. Hell no. And they go through a bunch of tweets coming from politicians, Justin Amash, AOC, commentators, Greg Price, Matt Walsh, Daniel Dresner, all kinds of people, left and right, that are not politically aligned. Rand Paul's chief of staff was actually responding, I think, thinking to AOC that they're on board. No way. Schumer, of all people. I think a lot of these people would be willing to do this. But right now, because of the media backlash or the public backlash about the release of it, they want to take a position that's popular, especially the fake resistance in the House. So I don't trust any of them to really follow through, but at least right now, the silver lining is that Congress doesn't seem willing to do this. Now, Ron Paul, I got forwarded this email. I was only able to copy it into a Google Doc here. For some reason, I haven't found this published. This is through his Campaign for Liberty. I'm not sure if he drafted it personally or what, but this is basically a summary of what he had to say. He said, this blatantly unconstitutional power grab has topped the statist wish list for years. So even though they may not be doing it today, we know that they didn't just draft the Patriot Act on September 12th, 2001. They didn't draft plans for invasion of Iraq right after 9/11 or just before it happened. A lot of this stuff is on the books. They're working contingency plans. They're getting people on board behind the scenes for year after year after year. And the fact that it's actually come out at this point says they really want to make it happen. And I don't think it's going to take too much for some of these really bad statists in Congress to suddenly go from hell no to be like, well, it's just temporary. It's just to protect safety. This is a really dangerous situation. We'll fix it in a month or in 2 months or by Easter or whatever the talking point may be. Ron Paul goes further in his email. He says, now with the nation gripped in fear, and panic. Attorney General William Barr and his Department of Justice goons think they have the perfect opportunity to ram it through. I'm assuming Ron Paul didn't actually write this out. It has its name at the end, but that is not, all the years I've been listening to the guy, that's not how he generally talks, but maybe. And he goes on, indefinite detention is among the most egregious in the torrent of emergency powers authoritarians have sought since this outbreak began. And John Whitehead put it this way, and this kind of goes into what I was talking about, how this kind of builds up for a long time before they actually implement it. This is over at the Rutherford Institute, published a couple of days ago. He says, the seeds of this present madness were sown several decades ago when George W. Bush stealthily issued 2 presidential directives that granted the president the power to unilaterally declare a national emergency. Again, if the president has the power to unilaterally declare a national emergency, then it is just, well, okay. And if a national emergency authorizes him to do stuff that the Constitution doesn't do, which actually is incorrect, but if people go along with that, every president is going to see everything as a national emergency. They're going to say 40 million people not having health insurance is a national emergency, or water flow into farms in California that affect the ability of a protected species to live. Maybe that's in a national emergency. I don't know. What could an authoritarian pig, what could a lover of the monster state define as an emergency? Just about anything and everything. And with all the money printing that's going on, with the QE, with the devaluing of the fiat dollar, the funny money, making it worse and worse and worse, there's going to be an economic emergency, that's for sure. We just don't know exactly when and how bad it's going to be, but it's bad. This is the biggest bubble in history, far bigger than what even happened in 2008. But going on, an emergency is loosely defined as, quote, any incident, regardless of location, that results in extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, or disruption. So businesses being closed, potentially 20-30% unemployment is certainly a disruption, severely affecting the U.S. population, infrastructure, environment, economy, or government functions. So anything that is considered a extraordinary level of casualty, damage, or disruption that's severe. Man, the way people could take this, it's just all personal perspective then. And then, of course, everyone thinks that their most important issue to them is something that's been severely affected. That is an extraordinary level of disruption, whether it's the infrastructure, population, environment, economy, or government functions. I think the only thing that would be real positive is if there was a severe disruption of government function. That would mean we have much more liberty. That isn't an emergency. That's a win. So they don't like it that way, of course. And John Whitehead goes with this. He says, mind you, that national emergency can take any form, can be, and he sums it up way better than I do, can take any form, can be manipulated for any purpose, and can be used to justify any end goal, all on the say-so of the president, this president or a future one. And he sums it up like this. What's the bottom line here? We are, for all intents and purposes, one crisis away from having a full-fledged authoritarian state emerge from the shadows, at which time democratic government will be dissolved and the country will be ruled by an unelected bureaucracy. I would say that we are really at that place already and have been for a long time, just because they haven't exercised every power that they've taken on you. Indefinite detention, gun control surveillance, restrictions on speech, whatever it may be. They've taken all these powers. They have it in presidential orders, congressional acts, from the courts backing them up over and over and over. Just because they haven't used every single one of them on you, and you and I can still communicate freely at this point, doesn't mean that some future politicians aren't going to see this as an opportunity to really clamp down. So I would say the largest government in the history of the world, which is what we live under, the largest military empire in the history of the world, is in many ways a full-fledged authoritarian state, one that spies on everyone at all times. It's silent. It's behind the scenes. It isn't as much like the Stalin-esque type of spying where you have, although my buddy Danny Panzella up in New York first alerted me to it, he says, and I'm not sure if he lives on Staten Island or what now, but he basically was pointing out how people in Brooklyn, for example, and other parts of Manhattan were calling the cops on people for being out on the beach. Now, I don't want to be around a lot of people here in Los Angeles as a general rule, but especially right now when I think a lot of people are not necessarily cautious. And in many ways, maybe the government is downplaying the health threat that we're facing. I don't know. I don't trust them. So I don't want to be around a lot of these people in the first place. And I wouldn't actually do that. But to call the cops who are really freaked out and aggressive in this type of a situation, it is a snitch culture. And the see something, say something that they pushed out of the Patriot Act and the September 11th terrorist attacks, people have that. Average normies have that mentality. We don't want to call government on each other. We want to convince and lead by example and actually talk to people instead of just having cops come in to beat their heads or government coming in to lock them away. That's not a really good thing. That's kind of a Stalin-esque society where everyone is afraid of everyone else. And I'm feeding into that because I'm not comfortable around a lot of other people, but for, I think, different reasons than what Danny was watching. It's not for people walking around on the beach. I can choose to avoid them if I want to. I have the free choice to not go there. Anyways, John Whitehead puts it this way: this is exactly the kind of mischief that Thomas Jefferson warned against when he cautioned, quote, "In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." And the short version of that is, like, look, don't trust politicians, don't trust government. Always require them to follow the Constitution. There's reasons that these things are in there. And even though government schools want us to kind of ignore those reasons, they don't teach us the history behind it. They are there for many reasons. I think James Madison, this is a quote that I've used many times. This was from a letter that he sent to Thomas Jefferson at the height of the ramp up just prior to the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts by John Adams when he turned into a bad guy. So this was in May of 1798. Madison said it this way: "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." I don't think anything could be more appropriate right now. Maybe, but this is incredibly timely. And he's not saying that dangers from abroad are always fake. They can be. Let's say they're real. Let's say every scare, every fear-induced thing that's happening right now, let's say it's all real. That doesn't mean you have to give up liberty for it. The only way that we can be safe and secure, I think, is when we're free. Looking over at the live chat, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you find this educational. The number one thing is that we're all learning as we go here. I think in my view, what we're learning is that government should never be trusted. And hopefully, if you weren't already there, I hope that that's kind of at least in the back of your mind. Christine Estep says, "God gave Thomas Jefferson wisdom. We should listen." Leslie Goody, he says, "The whole police system is on high alert. Our county sheriff basically said he was going to arrest anyone out of their homes and stop everyone driving as soon as the governor announced shelter in place." Where is that, Leslie? Oh, that's Michigan, I think, right? So here, they've been kind of taking a step-by-step approach, and I am very, very nervous about government in California, specifically Southern California. The LA County Sheriff, who is a longtime hater of the right to keep and bear arms. This is a guy so concealed carry is not really a thing here in California. Surprise, surprise. Neither is open carry, but there are people back when that was passed, where the restrictions came in much stronger. There are people who got exceptions for personal safety or whatever. And there's only a few dozen of them, I believe. And this sheriff is basically saying, yeah, the time has gone so long, let's take away their right as well. So this is a guy that really hates the right to keep and bear arms. So yesterday he announced that he thought that gun stores, where a lot of people here in California are lining up to purchase firearms, it is a very difficult process in California compared to other places. But he announced that gun stores were non-essential and he was going to be shutting them down. The highest ranking county attorney, later in the day or sometime overnight, basically disagreed, and she said, no, they are essential. I was blown away by that. The county attorney said that, so the sheriff is backed off. But the mayor specifically says, if you're not on our list of essential businesses, and you're not shutting down. And it's hard to really tell what qualifies as essential. Everyone thinks they're essential, of course, working and things like that. But the mayor is basically going to start shutting off water and power to businesses that don't follow requests to shut down. So government is certainly really ramped up. We see a high patrol level. I've seen some military transport planes. I'm almost certain I saw a couple, I mean, it looked exactly like them, a Marine Osprey flying over. We've got a lot of bases around here, so that's not super unusual. It's just that it's happening more often than normal. Essential Freedom asks, can the Fed just collapse already? Well, that's a dangerous situation, but at some point, I think it's going to happen. Looking a little further in the chat, Pete Hodgkin says goon is perfectly legitimate in this case. Yeah, and I agree. This is going back to Ron Paul's email. I'm not used to Ron Paul using that language, and maybe he's irritated. I've seen him get pissed off about stuff like this, so it's very possible. Eric Nance says the existence of specified exceptions demonstrates even more conclusively the lack of exceptions not specified. No doubt, no doubt. It's pretty crazy. And Leslie just sent me a Facebook personal message. Okay, that's on the link to what I need to keep track of. I appreciate that. Head Marie Flame Heather. That's a cool screen name over on Facebook. Those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it. And I think every time it just builds up and gets worse and worse and worse. And I know like Essential Freedom is often talking about wanting the whole system to collapse. And I would say, and I went to a speech by a guy named Chalmers Johnson. This is a guy who Ron Paul considered one of the best foreign policy experts around. He wrote a trilogy of books called Blowback. And the way he talked about it, he's like, look, if you really study history, I know some of us will just say, like, let's just let the whole thing come crashing down. But unless your society as a whole really believes in freedom, the odds of that happening is very low. Really, what they clamor for most times in history is a Mao or a Stalin to rise from the ashes, and that ends up making things worse. We don't want to collapse, but we don't want what we've got either. So the options that we're presented with are just evil all around. I don't know what to say. Going further here in the chat, HR 218 is the California CC permit for all 50 states. I'm not familiar with that, but if you've got a link over on Twitch, I would love to see that as well. Or I will go back in the comments too and probably look that up myself. When is the lockdown supposed to stop, says Geneva Anderson. Here in Los Angeles, the safer at home order goes through April 19th at minimum. Now, they keep telling us they could extend it, they could reduce it. I've seen some places talking about end of May, even further. Who knows? Most of it is really indefinite. And for those of you who are not on the coast, those of you who are not in Washington State, California, and parts of California is going to be different than here. I'm in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, so it is a different, very creepy feeling here. When you've got helicopters circling 24 hours a day, every 30 minutes to an hour, so a higher government presence on the streets and almost no one walking or driving, it is very eerie. So it's going to be different in other parts of the country, primarily the middle part of the country, but I would certainly keep an eye on how things are playing out in these larger areas, because I'm certain if things don't shift relatively quickly, the authoritarians in all the other states will let their kind of impulses through and we'll see things differently. I was surprised to see the other day that the Utah governor actually opposed the idea of some localities going on one of these stay-at-home orders. I'm not sure how that's played out. I've got some friends who live in that state, the great Suzanne Sherman, who I've been wanting to ask. Suzanne does great podcast, and she's written a number of articles for us. I wanted to mention to her, and this is just kind of a reminder to myself, I wanted to ask her if she would be interested in writing an article about some introductory prepping ideas for people that we could publish over here. Anyways, Christine Estep says it's just as creepy here as well. I think it's crazy everywhere. Anyways, I really appreciate you spending some time with me. I hope you are safe. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're stocked up. I hope you're safe from government. It's hard to, especially what they're doing to the economy. I know they want to hand out checks, and I saw an interesting tweet from someone the other day. It says, what does it take to turn a Republican, an anti-socialist Republican, into a socialist? And that is a $1,200 check. It's funny, but it's sad too, because so many people are just okay with this. And you can't tax and enslave the future to make yourself more free and prosperous today. It just never plays out like that. Again, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something. I'm grateful for you spending some time here today. If you support us, please do consider a membership if you're not already on board with that already. It starts at just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, wishing you safety, health, security, all that important stuff in these very, very weird and dangerous times. I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.